on the screen the word. Welcome everybody. Good to see you and good to catch up with people as we begin this course over 8 sessions. Is there life after COVID-19? And during the course of the sessions, we try to look at two areas. The first 4 sessions will be the search for meaning. And in the second 4, we'll turn to the search for moral values. So hopefully we can pursue those, and in discussion and conversations, we can perhaps help each other to think through some very big questions that have arisen because of this pandemic in which we now find ourselves. COVID-19 has aggressively interrupted our lives. It has ambushed us all around the world, governments, business, trading, sport, communities, families, individuals. We still speak of unprecedented times, a global experience that we've never encountered before. Where did this virus come from? Well, no one seems to know, which has not stopped the invention of conspiracy theories and scapegoating. In characteristic form, the American president has already produced early on 3 scapegoats, all attempting to deflect from failures and assert self-justification. The 3 scapegoats were the World Health Organization, the Chinese, and immigrants. More seriously, COVID-19 has killed people across the planet and has shut down life as we have known it. The focus for all of us has been to control the virus and hope that the scientific community can find as quickly as possible a vaccine that after trials is safe and can make global life together safer. The eradication of the virus is another issue and will take an exceedingly long time if it can be eradicated at all. The deaths from the viruses announced each day beginning to increase again. They sound very much like statistics. The numbers are necessary, but all of us have known that behind these statistics were very human stories, loved ones, horrendous grief and loss. Those who died were often without family at the end, surrounded by love and a presence provided by NHS staff. Families were brokenhearted and then were deprived of the important rituals of grieving and closure. There were no wakes, liturgies, requiem masses, services, symbols, stories, memorialization, thanksgiving, celebrations of life. The end needs to be ritualized, and the rituals were not available. For others who lost loved ones from other causes, there was the same loss of rituals so important to the grieving process. And the impact of this on people's lives and well-being is and will be enormous. And whether religious or humanist, different rituals and processes will need to be provided to enable people to process trauma and loss. There will also be demands on the professional community of bereavement counsellors, psychologists, and psychiatrists. For others, COVID-19 has created enormous anxiety, fear, isolation, loneliness, and stress. Jobs and income have been lost, and some may not be retrieved. The impact on mental health will be huge, and that has been talked about again this evening on some of the newscasts. It will continue for a long time, and for some, mental health issues will become physical health issues, even long-term issues. There is going to be no return to normality. Life as before. We will begin to live with, we are already beginning to live with a new normality, personal, social, national, and international life, as not known before. The suffering and experience of COVID-19 is an epoch-changing global moment. Now, there have been epoch-changing moments before, and however long the transition, humankind has been remarkably resilient and adaptable, but not without stresses and disorientation and dislocation and much suffering. Worlds or eras come and go, worlds or eras end, and out of the difficult birth pains, new life can be born. Living through the end, though, is painful, as is the challenge to reorientate to a new world. COVID-19 is such a moment in global history, and it is a moment of intense suffering when humans search for meaning and try to make sense of their experience. Humans are meaning-making animals. We need to make sense of our experience of life. The challenge to make meaning and make sense is now COVID-19, a shattering global experience of suffering. The deep questions are already beginning to emerge in our thought and consciousness, accompanied by deep angst, a sense of disorientation, maybe even anger. There are multiple why questions. Is there meaning in this suffering? It is a perennial question and one of life's ultimate questions. Whether or not there is a God or somebody out there, the ultimate question imposes itself upon us. We struggle in the search for meaning. Suffering cries out for meaning. Let's look then at some responses to suffering. There are different kinds of suffering. There is the suffering that belongs to the limitations of our being human. We are finite, and in our finitude we struggle. Our human limitations leave us vulnerable, and we live with this, so we try all sorts of things to overcome our vulnerability and finitude. We seek escape in drugs, alcohol, gadgets, diets, money, possessions, things, whatever promises to make us live longer or look younger. And consumerism is perhaps the greatest narcotic we know. There is moral suffering, the suffering that results from our wrong moral choices, self-centered lifestyle choices. These are corporate as well as personal. We abuse our bodies through smoking or bad eating habits, or we exploit and overuse the earth's fossil fuels. We often, from greed, develop and overstretch our production of products that pollute the atmosphere and the oceans and destroy the planet. There is much moral suffering, but we have no basis to complain to God or whoever when we suffer or loved ones die from our moral failures. When we become consumed by hatred, envy, and become anti-neighbor and engage in war and violence, we may, as we often do, bring in God to support our cause and back our country. But we have no recourse to this God when it all goes wrong or thousands suffer. There is natural suffering, the suffering that occurs from earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, volcanoes, and natural disasters. We may know scientifically why such natural disasters happen. Tectonic plates shift and are constantly in movement. Communities built over such fault zones will inevitably suffer greater from time to time. Tsunamis cause devastating suffering, but it is greater in those regions where there is the greatest poverty or a region is undeveloped. More wealthy and developed countries usually come out of such natural disasters relatively unscathed. The poor suffer most because of unjust inequalities and unjust economics. There is physical suffering, disease, viruses, sickness, physical and mental, sometimes a combination, and these seem to be part of life on Earth. We live life on the planet with few getting to the end of life without suffering at some point. In a traditional marriage ceremony, two people pledge themselves to each other in sickness and in health. Life perhaps begun in the expectation or knowing somewhere that this may well be the experience of both, and it usually is, perhaps most often in later years. Some illnesses can be traced to lifestyle choices, diets and living habits, and food production. Physical suffering, though, is still part of the life package. It comes with the territory. But why? In time, we may come to understand more about the coronavirus, its nature, its origins, hopefully the antidote, the vaccine. It has now ambushed us globally. It is an enemy, invisible and random. It is causing immense suffering, and we ask why. The disease has unsettled and disorientated us. We need to make sense of it, and so we search for meaning in our deep existential crisis. In the face of such suffering, seemingly unbearable and inexplicable, humans have sought meaning in three responses. One response is to say that this life is not all there is. There is life after death, another life which is better. Now, traditionally, this other life beyond the suffering of this life is described as heaven. It has also been described as eternal life, or as read at a Christian burial service from John's Gospel, "In my Father's house are many mansions." Part of this belief is that in this next life we may find justice and truth. There's no doubt that such words and belief bring comfort during the important rituals of death and burial. It may be how people make sense of God, God's goodness and justice. It is but a partial response, sometimes too glib, in the face of intense suffering and loss. The 10-year-old who lost his father through a terrible illness and was told by a well-meaning adult relative that God wanted to take his father to heaven, to a better place, the 10-year-old responded with, "Well, damn God." The 10-year-old may have had the better theology. Religious belief has included belief in an afterlife, but there is truly little given expression in Jewish and Christian sacred texts. There's nothing of it at all in the bulk of the Hebrew Bible, except in the writings a century or so before the birth of Jesus. It is present in the Christian Testament, though Jesus said very little. Much more of what he and Paul said being given an exaggerated emphasis by a form of Christianity mainly concerned with the next life and heaven when you die. The Greek philosophers also shared belief in an afterlife, and it is present in most world religions in various forms. But it is not core to living life and meeting suffering in this life. It can be an escape. As Jewish Rabbi Jonathan Sacks put it, the creation God pronounced good 7 times in Genesis 1, a Jewish way of expressing completion or perfection. It is in that world, he says, that the drama takes place, the tragedies occur, the questions arise, faith takes comfort, but not refuge in the world to come. Another response came from John Keats, the poet, and has been taken up by Quaker philosopher John Hick. Hick called it the veil of soul-making theodicy. He traced it back to the 2nd century theologian Irenaeus, who believed that humans were not created perfect, experienced the fall, and are still in the process of creation. Humans are raw materials, still being brought to glory, and that life in process is in the here and now. Keats then coined the phrase, veil of soul making. Keats felt that the world of pain and trouble is necessary to school an intelligence and make it a soul. Hick felt that the development of human personality, moral, spiritual, and intellectual, is a product of challenge and response. But the world is not always like that. People do suffer greatly and may reflect deeply about life and work out meaning, even becoming more compassionate and caring. It does not happen to all. And we cannot say with moral integrity that God permitted, still less willed, the suffering for the purpose of soul-making or moral development. The one example of moral suffering brought about by the evils of other humans, Eric Reton is right, surely, when he says, surely the Holocaust didn't need to happen. A third response is that there is evil, suffering is evil, and therefore there is no God. There is no question that in the face of intense suffering, especially innocent suffering, atheism is more than an option. Some may even feel that it is a moral option. But what is the moral logic? Nietzsche, the German philosopher who declared the death of God, was more honest than most. He stared into the logical abyss of the death of God and insisted that the death of the Christian God, he was, after all, German and a European, that the death of the Christian God would be the death of Christian morality, with its emphasis on kindness, compassion, forgiveness, and all the rest. A godless world would be a world with, as Jonathan Sacks put it, no limits to hubris, no principled constraints to the will to power. If there is no judge, there is no reason to expect justice. If there is no God, there is no transcendent thou shalt not. These, Sacks says, were not theoretical presuppositions or propositions in Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and communist China. They were put into practice, and tens of millions died. Now, the above may be more a response to moral suffering, but we are still left with the logic of the death of God. We are also left with the relentless question of suffering from disease, illness, and a coronavirus. How do we make sense of this and find some kind of meaning? I want to stop there. We're going to have 3 short inputs this evening, and after the second one, we will go into discussion groups, interactive discussion groups. But to perhaps ask a question for an open conversation at the moment, and we may stick to the question or we may not. Other questions and other comments and observations may arise, but it's a conversation. How do we respond to the various kinds of suffering? Is this punishment? Is this testing? Or do we not know at all? So over to you. Okay, Loretta.
So we're having a discussion, is it, Johnston? Yeah.
An open conversation, yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to just unmute yourself, or if you put your hand up, I can unmute you, and then we can, oh, there's Emma, great.
Could you ask the question again? It sort of buffered on me.
Siobhan.
Yes. Would you mind asking the question again? It buffered on me and I couldn't hear.
I didn't quite catch what you were saying. The question was, let me find it. How do we respond to these various kinds of suffering? Do we think suffering is punishment, or a testing, or a veil of soul making, or do we simply not know? Do we not have answers to those questions?
Johnson, I would have been brought up in the Catholic tradition with the notion that suffering was part of making you a better person. But I don't accept that anymore. I just don't understand the level of, well, I do, in one sense it is man-made, and man and woman-made. But doesn't mean I understand it. You know, I don't understand. I think a lot of it comes through greed. And why are we so greedy? I don't know.
What made you shift, Maeve?
My understanding of God. You see, I was brought up with God give all these punishments.
No.
I don't believe they come from God at all, no. But as a child, I'm talking about, you know, God was the big stick. No. But I don't believe that is so at all now, no. God is a loving God, and He wants the best there is for us, you know.
Okay.
So, anyhow.
I think many of us started there. I grew up in a rural community, and I wasn't Catholic, I was a Methodist, and that was par for the course as well. I had relatives who were told because they had illnesses or children born with conditions that this was the punishment of God, and because they had some terrible sins in their lives. It's out there, that idea.
Johnston, could I just say, to me, it's a part of life.
Yes.
Can you hear me okay? Yep.
Oh, yes, I can. Yes,
Yeah, sorry.
I was just listening.
My end.
Yeah.
It's a part of life, and that sounds very simplistic, but if I try and unpick that, what I think I'm saying is that I agree with you. I don't believe God, it's a punishment from God or anything like that. I think when things like the Holocaust happen, you've got to examine what went wrong with humankind to allow that to happen. Where did we lose the moral compass? And to a certain extent, if we believe there's a freedom of choice as humans within the faith that we adhere to, then we've got to be very careful the choices we make. And if I think about this critically from a faith point of view, I guess the criticism of people of faith is that we haven't been outspoken enough to try and prevent some of the things, or to talk. So let's take, for example, creation. We haven't been strong enough in our condemnation of an economic system that is basically destroying the planet. We've just happily gone along with the way it is. So to me, it's a part of life, and people of faith need to speak up for what's important from a faith perspective in life to try and limit the number of these issues that are happening.
Okay, thanks, Stephen.
Johnston?
Uh-huh.
I think it's really part of our journey, how we personally cope with our suffering, or it's and God is in the midst of it, and He is supporting. He's a God of love. He never leaves us. He never deserts us. We may think at times we're isolated, and alone, but God's always there. And I do believe that anything we have to go through in life, it's part of our journey, and
But you're not. I don't think you're saying that, as John Keats was saying, it's a necessary part of our moral development or our spiritual development. You're saying, I think it's part of our human experience.
Yes, and
there is a divine solidarity somehow in the midst of all that.
Yes, it is a spiritual journey.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I feel there are so many different sufferings. There's mental suffering and psychiatric suffering, the suffering when people commit suicide, the suffering when somebody is murdered or killed or it's a child, and we respond in different ways. I don't know if you were asking how we individually, personally experience suffering, but when we see the suffering of others, we're very touched by what's happened, but in different ways, because some of it we just can't understand. Whereas physical suffering, when it comes to an end, we usually say, well, as a Catholic anyway, well, that's a happy release for that person. They have suffered a lot. And, God has taken them away now from the suffering. They're at peace. But it's hard to say that when we see other very poor people suffering for lack of clean water, or for children from starvation, all that.
Yeah, I think the point you made at the beginning, Marcella, is a good one. We respond in different ways, each of us, and we all of us have personal experiences in some way of suffering, and how much we reflect on it, I'm not sure, but I think most of us do, and try to. It can very often reorientate our lives, but not after we've gone through a great deal of disorientation.
It's not necessarily of God. It's not God that's given it. It's causing the suffering for us, really. what's going through my head is the question, did Jesus have to die the way he died? Okay, maybe the foretelling was that he would die, but he didn't have to be crucified. It was the people that shouted, crucify him. And how much of our suffering comes back to how we as a corporate body care for each other. Not to mention the heirs, but
Yeah, we will. It's interesting. We're anticipating other evenings in the course, which is great.
oh, I'm sorry.
No. But all I'm saying is, Maeve, we will come to, when we come on night 4 to look at the passion in history,
Right, okay.
in real history. I think
I didn't know you were going there.
Why this innocent suffering, and where was God in that, if God was in it at all? Why have you abandoned me?
Yeah.
That cry from the cross. So all of that we will be exploring, and it's necessary to try and engage.
Are we going to have to live with the mystery of it, or
it could? Well, that's a question. Do we end up at the end of the day just living with the mystery of suffering, to which there are no rational explanations or theoretical answers?
Thanks.
But we'll get to the end of the course before we started it.
All right.
Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Anne.
Yes, I've been thinking of two things. One is I hadn't heard the Veil of Souls before, and is it VALE or VEIL?
Yeah, VALE.
Right.
A place we pass through.
Yeah. Yes. And the other thing I was thinking was, is there any? Can you feel empathy if you haven't felt suffering? So, you know, is it part of making us whole that we can then empathize?
It's interesting that Archbishop Romero, I think, once said, the late Archbishop Romero once said that there are things we cannot know except through tears.
Yes. Yeah.
There may be something in that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any liberation in suffering.
Okay.
I think it's oppressive. And I think the challenge is to help people out of suffering. I think suffering, if in relation to God, I think that God is working alongside those who are trying to liberate people from suffering. Which is expressive of it challenges the idea of an omnipotent, all-powerful God, that I think has done a lot of damage to our understanding of suffering.
So there's a big God question behind it somewhere.
Yeah.
What we mean by God.
Yeah.
Ruth is trying to get in.
Henry appeared momentarily there.
Yeah.
It was Kathy's comment there. My thoughts on suffering. I grew up with two aunts with rheumatoid arthritis. One of them, both of them, but one in particular, I would sort of classify as a personal saint. And it was it's freedom. She had a freedom. She was incapacitated, but in her mind and her acceptance of her sufferings, she was a much freer person than I am in my wholeness. So that's my reaction to what Kathy was saying. And I suppose the other person I'm thinking of, Gordon Wilson, there was a freedom with Gordon in his relationship to God that I only can aspire to. And it was suffering to me that's played a big part in both those people that I'm thinking of. that's just what I'm thinking there.
What was it? Was it the suffering that created the freedom, or was it the person's response and attitude towards the suffering?
Well, I think it's what you said, Oscar, and now said some things can only be known through suffering, perhaps. So, is it the challenge and the response? Is the suffering either going to beat you, or are you going to beat the suffering and turn it into a positive? I don't know. I'm figuring it out.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. The truth is, Henry, few of us do know. Take some comfort from that. Ruth, you were trying to get in a moment ago.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed listening to what everyone has to say. I guess there's a temptation to see the pandemic through the eyes of God sending a message to mankind because we've messed up so thoroughly in terms of our moral values and in other ways. And yet the reality is that when Jesus came to this earth, he said the kingdom of God is here. And he absolutely showed us the way to God and the way to overcome suffering. And in many ways, to add anything in, like COVID-19, is to try to negate what Jesus did on the cross when he died for our sins. So God doesn't need to send a global pandemic to wake us up, send us a new message. We've got the message, and it's a matter of the kingdom of God is here through Jesus, rather than looking for additional signs and additional messages, if you like. And I think even atheists blame God for things like this, and that's a contradiction in terms, because they'll say, if there's God, how can he possibly allow a global pandemic? But the reality is, it's mankind's fallenness that creates an environment in which a pandemic flourishes, surely. It's not what God wills for us in this life, that he loves us and sent the Son to die for us.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to God. Obviously, the God question is not going to be terribly far away through all 8 sessions of this course. But let's move on now to a second bit, and then we'll come perhaps to. Kathy will be glad to know, looking for a tea break earlier, that we're getting closer and closer to this tea break. But anyway, we'll look at the search for meaning for a few moments and see where that takes us. And after that, and maybe after the tea break, we'll go into groups for some discussion. But between 1918 and 1920, the world experienced a flu pandemic, claiming up to perhaps 100 million lives. Now, much to their anger and their disgust, the Spanish were blamed for it being called the Spanish flu. That, of course, was not true, but it provided the powerful countries of the time with a scapegoat. It was in Spain, though, that a bizarre and disturbing experience developed at the time. In a place called Zamora, a new bishop had been appointed in 1913, and he tried to give meaning to the pandemic. Many were dying in Zamora, and like many other communities, there was lockdown and there was self-isolation. The authorities were infuriated by Bishop Bolano, who during all of this held a 9-day novena in the cathedral in honor of St. Rocco, patron of plague and pestilence. Bolano said that the pandemic was, quote, due to our sins and ingratitude, for which the avenging arm of eternal justice has been brought down upon us. The cathedral was packed for 9 days, with many people kissing relics. Later, after many more deaths, when the worst had passed, the bishop attributed the passing of the epidemic to God's mercy. He expressed sorrow for lives lost. He praised those who, through their attendance at many novenas and masses, had placated God's legitimate anger. Now, maybe there are always those, perhaps like Bishop Bolano, who think they have direct access to God's secret diaries and know God's mind with some certitude. His was a no-lose theology, the pandemic being God's avenging justice to begin with, and then when passing due to God's mercy, the divine anger being placated by the prayers of the people at the novenas. Now, such theology can never lose or be wrong. At the same time, the bishop took no responsibility for causing deaths by bringing thousands together in a time of social restrictions to control the spread of the deadly flu. Such theology does not allow for much social responsibility, and error of judgment does not arise. Through social media, letters to the press and public statements, similar theology has been heard again during COVID-19. In language of the 19th century, we always appear to be in the hands of an angry God. Laura Spiney, whose book relates that story, entitles the chapter in which she relates the story of Bishop Bolano, The Wrath of God. And Wrath of God theology, she's not agreeing with Bolano, by the way, but she uses the title Wrath of God. And Wrath of God theology emerges in pandemics and natural disasters and crises of suffering as imagined meaning. But are they advocates of such imagined meaning, projecting their own fear, angst, anger, and violence, even vindictiveness, onto the being they think is in charge of all things? In 1755, the Portuguese city of Lisbon was hit by a huge earthquake and 50,000 people died. The disaster affected everyone and shattered all optimism about life in the 18th century. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, knew exactly what the earthquake was about. It was, he said, God's punishment for the sins of the Inquisition. Now, strange that at the heart of Wesley's theology was the all-embracing universality of God's love, a love that knew no bounds, was for all people and was already within all people. Now 50,000 Portuguese were wiped out for the sinful horrors of an Inquisition which was Spanish and not Portuguese. If God gets so angry, then why not hurl a few deadly thunderbolts at Madrid rather than Lisbon? Now, Wesley's theological meaning given to the Lisbon earthquake was, I think, and I say this as a Methodist, I think was irrational and illogical and totally out of sync with his universal love divine, all loves excelling. There is no meaning or explanation for such much suffering, but we rush, maybe without thinking very often, into divine punishment. It happened, you remember, when HIV hit the planet, claiming 1.5 million lives alone in 2013. And for too many, this was God's punishment and was blamed on homosexuality. Yet again, in the present, there have been religious responses attributing the virus to God's judgment or chastisement because of our acceptance of abortion and same-sex marriage. Now, incredibly, we had a mid-antrim unionist councillor and a Vatican cardinal singing from the same hymn sheet. Such a theological attempt at meaning is neither reasonable, rational, nor moral. It victimizes women, often struggling in complex life situations, and it demonizes the LGBTQI community in what can only be described as homophobia. Perhaps the councillor and the cardinal were in the grip of fear and projecting their punitive and angry mindsets onto the universe and talking to a God who is very much in their own image. If there is a God, then the most we humans in our finitude and vulnerability know of God is that we do not know. We try to say something, and in our search for ultimate meaning, we need to have some sense of a moral being. The vindictive, angry, punitive God who sends COVID-19 to punish or test us is not moral, even by human standards. We humans bring the butcher of the Balkans to be tried for crimes against humanity. COVID-19 has demolished all exceptionalism, whether it be national, racial, religious, or personal exceptionalism. The virus is invisible, it's global, it's random. We search for meaning, but some of our theological systems, like the economic systems, are on the brink of collapse. COVID-19 is an apparent lottery. Who or what is God in the COVID-19 pandemic? And with the demolition of exceptionalism, what do we now make of providence and a divine being who watches over, as one poet said, watches over his own, whoever his own are? There is perhaps no exceptionalism after COVID-19. There is no God with a special people protected from the virus. Providence in the sense of God caring for and protecting Christians, Jews, Muslims, white people, the chosen or especially loved. Well, that's going to need some radical rethinking and reimagination. There has been no divine intervention either. But then many of us have lived through, all of us have lived through at least part of the 20th century of catastrophic war, violence, genocides, flu pandemics, not to mention deadly famines, and the supernatural interventionist God never appeared. The God or the God question will not go away. As humans, we not only search for meaning, but are haunted by the mystery and the transcendent. Philosophers and theologians have grappled with ultimate questions of meaning for as long as we have had thinking and imaginative beings. As humans, we try to explain the suffering of the world. In 300 BCE, a Greek philosopher wrestled with the dilemma. Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BCE, put it in a rather convoluted way, but expressed in the present in a more simplified way by Bart Ehrman. God is all powerful. God is all loving. There is suffering. And Ehrman goes on to ask in his book, how can all three be true at once? If God is all powerful, then he is able to do whatever he wants and can therefore remove suffering. If he is all loving, then he obviously wants the best for people and therefore does not want them to suffer. And yet people suffer. How can that be explained? Ehrman may have simplified the Epicurean articulation of the conundrum, but the complexity and difficulty in the question of ultimate meaning remains. Ehrman's subtitle to his book, How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer, is not quite true, as he himself acknowledges towards the end of his book. He does find an important insight for meaning in one of the wisdom writings of the Hebrew Bible, and we'll return to that in the last session. Loretta, we'll move into groups, but I'm suggesting at this stage that we maybe take our 10-minute break and come back about nearly 8 o'clock, yeah, it is 8 o'clock, and then we can go into the groups. You have rooms or whatever they're called, I think, allocated, so we can explain that. We can explain the group work, but let's go off now and have a welcome cup of tea, coffee, or whatever else you want to drink at this stage.
I don't know.
Johnston, I imagine that
Roy Crow, were you there all the time?
I'm there all the time, just keeping quiet in the background listening.
Yeah, good man.
Yeah, no, I mean, talk about the winter flu going round. In theory, like, if we're all distancing, we shouldn't be getting the flu either. Never mind COVID. You know? So,
yeah.
I mean, if it's as easy to get a winter flu, it's as easy getting COVID. So, you know, one should eradicate the other.
If both spike together, will be the same thing.
Yeah. I was interested, Johnson, one of comments read in Walter Brueggemann's book. I think it was a Jewish man that mentioned it. Is the virus God's way of ending consumerism, or the end of the narrative of globalism?
Oh yeah. Well,
the comment.
Yeah.
Of what's going on in the world.
Well, I think we've discovered that, I mean, COVID has exposed a whole lot of things.
Yeah.
It exposed institutionalized racism. It's exposed bad economic systems. It's exposed the negative and devastating effects of the economic dimension to globalization.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think all of those things are challenged. Do we go back to normality? Which does normality mean going back to the old economic systems, where
isn't that
or is something going to change?
Yeah, isn't that what they're trying to do? Get back to the normal run of life, and without having serious lockdown, or
I think one historian said a few months ago, I've forgotten his name now, that there will be a battle for the narrative.
Yeah.
And we know that from within our own little community. There has been a constant battle for the narrative, the historical narrative, and the rewriting of history and all the rest of it. But on this one, there will also be, he's suggesting, a battle for the narrative. There will be the gatekeepers. There will be the establishments who will want to go back to the old systems, the old models, be it education, be it economics, environmental stuff. But I think we need to recognize that there is a battle there to be fought, if we can use that imagery. To ensure that they said in Hong Kong about going back to the normal. There never was a normal in the first place.
No. Yeah.
Is Loretta there? We need to go to groups. We're having an interesting conversation. A few of us, maybe everybody's in somewhere. Hello, are we all back?
It's 8:05. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just the same as it always is in Dramalis. More as 15 minutes breaks become 25.
We're all back.
Okay, there are 4 groups, and hopefully Loretta will
She's there.
The question is, what do we make of the dilemma, the Epicurean conundrum that was posed? God is all powerful, God is all loving, there is suffering. God is all powerful, God is all loving, there is suffering. Now, I think if you would talk around that for about 15 minutes in your groups. I don't know how many groups, but Loretta will allocate. And we'll see. We'll not take feedback, but we might have a short, open conversation and then go on to the third and final part.
So that's question 2 of your questions, isn't it, Johnston? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it is.
It's in the chat, just, so that everyone will have it once we go into the rooms.
The third part, and then we can bring the evening to an end with an open conversation. Okay. Well, that deeper insight of the Hebrew writings that we mentioned at the end of the last input is expressed by Jonathan Sacks in one of his books. Faith, which is a search for meaning, he says, feels both sides of the contradiction that God exists and evil exists. He writes this: the more powerfully I feel the existence of God, the more strongly I protest the existence of evil. This is why in the Abrahamic faith it is the giants of faith, not the skeptics or cynics, who cry aloud as Moses and Jeremiah and Habakkuk cried aloud, with a cry that echoes through the ages. This is why Job refuses to be comforted, and why he would not let go of God. Now, Sachs points out that there is a difference between a contradiction and a cry, and no amount of thinking will solve a contradiction. It will not change the world, but faith will and does. Something begins to change when there is a cry of protest. The cries of Abraham, Moses, and Jeremiah, says Sachs, were cries born in the cognitive dissonance between the world that is and the world that ought to be. The only way of resolving this dissonance is a deed. That is the difference between faith as acceptance and faith as protest. So faith, he's saying, is protest at dissonance between the world as it is and what it's meant to be. The cry of protest has led not just Abraham, Moses, and Jeremiah to commit to change. Those with faith as protest are, in his words, disproportionately to be found among lawyers fighting injustice, economists fighting poverty, doctors and medical researchers fighting disease, and teachers and academics fighting ignorance. Now, this has been described as sacred discontent or sacred unrest, and it has been an energy at the heart of much of our European experience and elsewhere, not the timeless, changeless religion or privatized, individualized faith as acceptance, but as the human drive to change the world and transform suffering and evil, injustice and hatred. It is a spiritual quest. In Sachs's words again, driven by the cognitive dissonance of a faith that sees the world as it is, while refusing to let go of its vision of the world as it ought to be. In that world, contradiction is to be resolved, not by philosophical thought, but by redemptive deed. So we can resign ourselves to the suffering, we can philosophize and we can theologize on theodicy, we can try to justify the ways of God or explain why the suffering, but spiritual unrest, protest, energizes the redemptive, liberating deed. The search for meaning is not an explanation, but in doing the liberating good to transform and change. And this is where Bart Ehrman catches up with what he calls a biblical view of suffering. It is a wisdom writing known in the Hebrew Bible as Ecclesiastes. Now, the writer's not popular with some people of faith as they perceive its tone as too cynical about life. All is vanity, vanity of vanities is a repeated mantra. Everything is a great puff of wind. There is deeper wisdom, though, as Ecclesiastes recognizes cognitive dissonance and realizes there are deep ultimate questions for which there are no intellectual answers. We just go on and on asking them, he suggests, and perhaps waste our time. Why go on asking them? Go, live life and enjoy it. Make the best of it. And then the heart of his wisdom, go and do some good. No matter how small, do good to another. And the doing of good perhaps changes things, provides meaning, is an existential response to the existential crisis. The 20th century Jew, like the author of Ecclesiastes, a 20th century Jew, Viktor Frankl, survived the horrors of Auschwitz and other concentration camps. And out of his unimaginable experience of suffering, he wrote his classic book, Man's Search for Meaning. He writes of the meaning of love, now written back early 1950s or whatever. His language is not inclusive. No one, he writes, can become fully aware of another human being unless he loves him. Furthermore, by his love, the loving person enables the beloved person to actualize these potentialities. He makes these potentialities come true. Frankl is saying that meaning is possible because of love, the altruistic love of the other. And in Jewish keeping with the erotic Song of Songs in his Hebrew Bible, the experience of ultimate togetherness he's saying, is sexual love. There is the self-transcendence of human existence, self-forgetting by giving oneself to a cause or another person to love. Meaning is found, Frankl suggests, in 3 responses: by creating a work or doing a deed, by experiencing or encountering someone, by an attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering. Frankl consciously refuses to be or to become a victim or even a survivor, but to center life on a cause which is good. It is also in allowing the goodness or compassion of another or others, or the deep love of another, to envelop one's being. In the search for meaning and suffering and all that disorientates us, we throw our lot in with the mystery of goodness. Frankl and Ecclesiastes are on the same song sheet. They are both, after all, and this is significant, I think, Jewish. In the search for meaning in the suffering of COVID-19, there may be no satisfactory intellectual answers or theoretical reasons. There were no answers or reasons for suffering in the book of Job, and we look at that next Tuesday night. The great paradox may be that meaning can be found in giving ourselves to a higher vision, a greater good, a common good, and living for it. Doing justice, being compassionate, loving others in personal and public life, and in relationships with humans and nature, we can know ourselves as moral beings. And perhaps we can find meaning and know something of the sacred. Now, I'm not sure where your discussion in groups took you. We can reflect on that for a few moments. We've still got some time left. But there's also, I hope, an opportunity to reflect on the third question. Meaning is found in doing good, loving another, cultivating an attitude of self-forgetfulness. Is that true? So meaning is found in doing good, loving another, cultivating an attitude of self-forgetfulness. Is that true? An open conversation for the last 20 minutes or so. We're all on air, are we?
Can you repeat that, Johnson, please? Just
go into your chat box, you'll get it.
Oh, I don't.
No, I tried that, but it didn't.
Sorry. I'll get there. Don't worry. Thank you.
Not in my chat box.
Meaning is found.
Johnson,
loving,
a question.
Cultivating,
is there a difference between recognizing you can find meaning in doing good, but yet accept that suffering isn't good? I think sometimes we get that confused, which is why I was trying to say earlier on that I think that if we accepted the notion that God is behind suffering, or that God allows suffering, we have to ask, what kind of God is it?
Yes.
That's my conception, okay? So I think that we have to make a distinction between how we can find meaning in doing good and striving to overcome suffering and challenging suffering, and that's a very different thing from even thinking that suffering in itself is good.
Well, there may be 2 questions you're asking, I think, but I think for Viktor Frankl, meaning was found in doing good, and he had no doubt whatsoever that the suffering that he had endured was not in any way good.
Yeah,
it was in fact evil.
Yeah.
He doesn't attempt to say that God sent this, or God permitted this, or God did this or that or the other thing. Being Jewish, he might even have been happy to leave the God bit out of it, in his answer. Jews can be wonderfully agnostic about certain things, and argumentative as well. But I think there's no question. Meaning for him was found in doing good, loving another, loving a cause. But absolutely no way were those concentration camps in any way, and the suffering that he experienced, and it was unimaginable. No way was that good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is it a fact, Johnston, that suffering is a fact of life in the world that we live in? One of the comments in our group was that COVID is not God's doing, it is man's consequence of man's works in eating animals and doing things that has brought that on, that we have reaped what we sow. And maybe if there's suffering in the world, the question is how we respond to it. Do we respond to it looking for God's mercy and God's presence, or do we stand and protest and blame God for it? Or do we learn through the experience of finding God's presence in the midst and responding by doing good, by coming alongside those that can't find God in the midst?
I think we also have to love the cause. If we want it to improve, we've got to do something about it.
Yeah.
I think for that reason, Johnston, would it be fair to say that if Sachs was here today, he'd say it's true, given what you told us about the sacred unrest? You know, faith is a protest against the world as is, as opposed to how it should be. And the way you're going to bridge that gap, I would have thought, is by doing good, whatever way that pans out, you know. And I think that what you told us about Sachs, that sacred unrest, is really helpful, because in our little group, we were talking about that tension between good and evil, but it's difficult to maybe make that very distinct. But I think Sachs' thing, faith is a protest against the world as is, as opposed to how it should be, just puts it in a, says it very nicely.
Yeah, his two expressions were sacred discontent and sacred unrest. And then he went on to talk about the contradiction, or whatever, is not to be resolved by philosophical thought, but by redemptive deed, liberating deed, liberating good, or as Helen's saying, doing something to change systems, to change whatever. I think going back a little step to Ruth's point, we're not. I think where you began, Roy, was resonating. Suffering is part of life. I'm not sure we know exactly where it's all coming from, or what's causing it, but it's part of our human experience. And I think when we get to next week, you quoted the very Deuteronomistic viewpoint. We reap what we sow.
Yeah.
We're looking at Job next week. Job is a big protest against that theology.
Yeah. And he said he wasn't reaping what he sowed. He would maintain he was not reaping what he'd sown.
Yeah.
So God, it's all your fault.
He's in total opposition to the theology of Deuteronomy and the theology of Proverbs.
Yeah.
So take your pick.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I just don't think that God has any responsibility for suffering in the world. He's not responsible anyway for that. So.
Could we go back? And that case, maybe we go back to a question I think Kathy posed quite a while back, and it was really, what do we mean by God? What are we? Yeah. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think about Jesus more, Jesus rather than God actually.
And what?
And all in one. I mean, I just
provide any clue to what we might mean by the sacred.
No, I mean, I'm really clueless about that. All I know is that from a very early age, I just knew that there was this special person in my life and leading me in different ways. I mean,
Okay.
very positive about that. But it's God, Jesus, you know.
Yeah, Johnston, when you were talking about Frankel, the three things there, I was wanting to ask if you had any idea, if we have any idea of what motivated Frankel, like what may have led him to think that. I mean, one can state those three things quite intellectually, but the kind of intellectual statements that obviously spring from some very powerful sense of self, or sense of being, or sense of what life is about. That's what, and that in turn ties up for me with this question that we ask, like, what do we mean by God?
Yeah, okay.
What is it that motivated Frankel?
I can't fully answer that, Richard. I would need to look a great deal more in depth at Viktor Frankl and his other book that has just come to light again after decades. The title of it I've forgotten, but he does talk in this one about the self-transcendence and self-forgetting, and I think he obviously was faced and lived through a very deep existential crisis and trauma and unimaginable suffering. But what is it that makes a person, and it's not answering your question, but it's asking the question again in another way, what makes a person refuse to be a victim or even to refuse to be a survivor? There is some kind of being able to self-transcend or transcend oneself there and reach not an intellectual answer, but and I think key to Frankel as well in all of that was relationality. It's about being able to love another or love others or be in relationship, and without relationships, without the solidarity of relationships as well, perhaps that also helps to move through to a more self-transcendent point where there's a refusal to be a victim, the refusal to be a survivor, and to do the deed, to do the good, and to love, and build relationship, and the cause. Now that's as far as I can go at the moment with that. I would need to read a lot more about Viktor Frankl, I think, to get to the bottom of what really motivated, what really was driving, what really caused him to reach or enabled him to reach the point he reached in his attitude. And that was the third thing he was talking about, the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering. How did he reach the particular attitude that he had? I don't have an answer to that.
One of the best books I've read recently was looking at Jewish women who were struggling during the Shoah, and it was written by a feminist Jewish theologian, and one of the things that she reflected on was Levinas's idea that you see God in the face of the other, and she said that for many of the women it was the kind acts that they were shown by other people, other Jewish people in that experience, maybe sharing a crust of bread, or picking them up when they were down, or holding them up when they were standing on the lines, or trying to save their lives. it was those moments of love that actually revealed God.
Yeah.
And fleeting, but they were enough to give people hope that this evil that they were experiencing wasn't all that there is. And it was also a reminder of the deep humanity of each person. And I think that that's where we know God, where we experience God, and that says to me more about God than some of our ideologies, because I think ultimately we can't know who God is, but we can know God through other people.
So relationality is crucial.
Yeah.
It's what we understand. You know, your question saying meaning is found in doing good, it strikes me that that's the level that humans operate on. We, what Kathy was saying, you know, through good deeds from other people, we understand life through relations and relationships. So the all-loving God and the all-powerful God is a little bit harder for us to actually understand. We can believe it and we can say it, but what we do understand is the things we do for one another. And I think that brings in your question about loving one another and cultivating an attitude of self. I think it was self-forgetfulness. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank you.
Is it when Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive? There's a sense of fulfillment, a sense of blessing in doing the good, that we find fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Frankel talks about the altruistic love of the other. That would be loving without expecting anything in return.
Yeah. But that's where we find fulfillment.
Or find meaning.
Or meaning, yeah.
Yeah.
In relationships.
Any other reflections from the group discussion that some of you had? Some of you have mentioned one or two things, but were there other things there?
While we're looking for the answer to that, could I? This is really to engage a little bit with Kathy. Levinus, or I don't know how you pronounce his name, but I discovered him about 10 years ago, and he's my favorite philosopher, I would say. I just want to. I think that I have stopped needing to talk about God in this situation, that situation, or another situation. So I love Levinus, or Levinus, however you pronounce his name.
Yeah.
I love him for the way he situates ethics as you gaze at others, at the people in our society, and so on. I like that. I've reached a point myself, I think, where the other doesn't require me to talk about God being in the other. The other is simply the other. And so I think my own theology has become literally a very worldly theology, in that it's a theology that doesn't need to talk about God.
Okay. You might need to say a bit more about that, Richard. And go back to the question you posed a few minutes ago, which is an ultimate question in many ways. And I'm deliberately using the the spelling rather than the actual word. What do we mean by?
Actually, I love the word God, theos, and I love theology. But my starting point is my own experience.
Yeah.
It's the only experience I've got, Johnston. I don't have the experience of being Johnston or Kathy or Jean. Yeah, I don't. I just don't. I just have the experience of being Richard. And as I was saying in the group, what I've known all my life, that my experience of my life cannot be summed up in what I know, what I accomplish, what I'm capable of. There is a dimension that, well, the jargon is the transcendent. And I've known that. And I know it in many ways, through music, through poetry, through culture, through the rituals of worship, through really first-class theology and theological talk. I know it. And I'm very grateful to my culture that it has supplied me with words like God and Jesus and the Bible tells you so. All of those things. I'm glad my culture has supplied me with all that jewelry, with all that wallpaper that I can draw on to make sense of both my own inner experience and then my experience of growing up and maturing in the world at large. So I have no trouble in church on Sunday using the word God and the Trinity. In fact, sometimes I have sometimes an arrogant feeling that I'm more at home in the creeds than many other people in the church saying the creeds, because I'm living in the creeds. I'm not just saying them. They supply meaning to me. And the word God supplies meaning to me. And theological teaching supplies meaning to me. And when Kathy comes down to Belfast from Derry and talks to us about her new book, I'm supplied with riches of meaning. But they all somehow are processed by that innate capacity that is grace, that innate capacity to sense that life is bigger and beyonder than what's tangible and immediate.
I think, Richard, you're using language in a particular way, and that would resonate. I think you're using language largely as symbol, and it is where I would see the word God in a sense as a symbol, but a symbol that provides meaning. And there comes a point where, and it's not a new thought, the theological thought that goes back to the earliest centuries, particularly amongst the Greek minds and theologians, that the most, and including the greatest theologian and philosopher who came out of this island, John Eugenia, the most we know of God is that we don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, surely it's one of the profound mysteries. God is spirit, and how we understand, how we ever come to understand what the spiritual realm is, never mind our spirit, and how we encounter God in spirit and worship in truth. That's all a massive journey.
Are we frozen?
Isn't it?
That may be the depth of ourselves, and I'm not sure that we can know ourselves either.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah. unless others help us in that journey.
Well, relationality, I think,
Yeah.
is key. And this is Levinas's point that Kathy was making. Whatever we know of the sacred that we don't know, it's in relationship. It's in the face of the other.
Yeah.
Sorry, Johnson. I can't go past your Viktor Frankl and his example. And you read a lot about the Holocaust and things, and the apathy of so many people within that. And you think, but people of spirit, people with a little bit more spirit, a bit more, and is that spirit like the Spirit of God? That some people were blessed with that bit of something extra to help their fellow man and do that little something that made all the difference. I mean, sociologists, have written aeons about, why they let so much happen to them. That people didn't, they just became so apathetic. They did nothing to help themselves. But then you get someone with that little bit of spirit. Is that God given? Is that what was needed, or?
Well, it may lie. What Rabbi Jonathan Sachs is drawing attention to is protest, faith as protest, faith that. Now, maybe that's what you're saying. It takes a bit of spirit to protest instead of being apathetic or just accepting, passive acceptance. And if we go back to one of the defining stories of the Hebrew narrative, the Exodus. Now, it's not without its problems trying to understand what it is and how it's being written about in the biblical books, but it seems to me that begins in protest. Protest against oppression, protest against wrong, protest against suffering, and it is that protest that changes things, brings about change. Moses protests against the Egyptian taskmaster who was inflicting suffering upon people. Actually murdered him. That might be a bit extreme, but it's protest, and it's when we protest against the cognitive dissonance that there is a possibility of change and transformation and liberation.
Can I
and
just,
meaning.
Yeah, sorry, John. I was listening to a podcast this morning on Aristotle, and he in his Nicomachean Ethics, that's his big book about ethics. One of the things he said about happiness is finding what you're good at that makes a contribution to the good and doing it as well as you can. Now, I think we all have different gifts, and I think that we all have different experiences. We bring different things to community, which is why community is important. And I think that if you take the show as an example, some people were able to protest by doing small things. Other people weren't able to, but that wasn't a reflection on who they were. And I think that it's about finding the gift that you have for good and doing whatever you can with it. Some people are leaders, other people will support the leader. Some people might not be able to stand up and protest, but they might be able to support in other ways. So I think it's about recognizing as community together we have different gifts and we can bring whatever those gifts are. And for those that can't do it, we carry them with us and help them. I think sometimes we can put pressure on people who are suffering terrible things and who are struggling even to cope with the suffering. And maybe it's not their place. Maybe they can't protest. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, but it's where we need it's where we need human solidarity
Yeah.
and relationality.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, look, we've gone to 9 o'clock, and I think there's no end to questions, no end to whatever. But that's the beginning of our program. Is there meaning in suffering? And next week we'll explore one of the classic pieces of literature, recognized as classic, whether it's part of a sacred text or not. Job's sufferings, arguing with God without answers. So we'll take a look at that next Tuesday night. But thank you to all of you for being part of it, and engaging in a conversation in a.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. God bless everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Everybody else.
Bye.
Bye.
Good
night.
Good night.
Thanks, Johnson. Thank you.
Night. Hi, Grace, how are you?
Night.
Night, Johnson.
Good night. Okay, Loretto, thank you.
See you next time.
See you next time.